What up, dudes? Today we're going to be talking about Matthew chapter 1. That's the one we're talking about. So let me show you a cool picture. There's my cool picture. I thought that was like really cool. Let's jump into the text real quick. So this is Matthew chapter 1, and we are in the Bible study for the Bible study with me. And we're going to be going over Matthew chapter 1 today. But this video is going to be like very harsh, because basically what this video is going to be, it's going to set the tone for the whole series. Basically what we're doing is we're doing an entire Bible study on the Gospel of Matthew. In other words, we're literally going to go through the entire Gospel of Matthew and look at every word. But the point is that chapter 1, what we're going to learn in this chapter is going to set the tone for the rest of the book. It's going to set the way in which we read the book. I'll give you an example of what I mean. A lot of people talk about worldviews, and basically a worldview is a lens. So think of it as like wearing glasses. So if you're wearing glasses that are green glasses, everything that you look at is going to be green. If you're wearing red glasses, then everything that you look at is going to be red. And so that's what a lens is. So when we talk about a lens, that's how we see it. And so when we approach the Bible, we approach the Bible with lenses, whether we know it or not. That's how we approach the Bible. And so the lens that we want to approach the Gospel of Matthew with is not a lens of spirituality. So that's the way that a lot of people do it. That's the way a lot of pastors do it. What they do is they go into the Gospel, they try to find some spiritual truth because that's their end goal. They want to, increase spirituality or something like that. That's not really what we want to do. We're definitely going to point those things out as we go along, but that's not what we want to do. What we actually want to do is understand the Gospel of Matthew based on how it was written. So we want to understand who Matthew was, we want to understand when it was written, and we want to understand the audience that it was written to. In other words, we want to understand authorial intent. This is more an exegetical approach to the gospel. That's really what we're doing. So if you don't know what exegesis is, if you've heard exegesis, which of course if you spend any time in church, you've heard exegesis. It's apparently where you study it in context. And let me just tell you, like most pastors and teachers and all that stuff, these people you see on the internet, they talk about the context and they talk about doing exegesis and stuff like that. None of them hardly ever take stuff in context, and none of them hardly ever do an exegesis. Most of them just do eisegesis, which is where they take their own idea and then they insert it into the text, and then they mistakenly say, oh, this is an exegesis. Well, they're not doing an exegesis. Because when you exegete a passage, you're looking for the authorial intent. In other words, you're looking for what the author originally intended when they originally wrote it, which, of course, that means that you have to establish a good date. And if you're first of all going to say, well, Matthew the tax collector wrote the Gospel of Matthew and it was written in 50 CE, you already got it wrong. Because now it comes back to the lens. That's the lens in which you're going to view the entire gospel. It's because you're viewing it as an apostolic writing, because Matthew the tax collector was an apostle. And so therefore you're going to view it as Matthew the tax collector is writing all the stuff that went down. Well, the problem is that lens does not work when you read the gospel that way, because by the time you get to the end of it, you go, well, wait a second. There's no way that this Matthew guy, this tax collector guy, could be the author of this book. There's just no way. So now all of a sudden you're really messed up, and it gets very bad. You don't want to do that. Instead, what you want to do is you want to get the author right, and you want to get the date right. First of all, we don't know who Matthew is. It's not Matthew the tax collector. That's the first thing you need to get. Second thing you need to get is that most scholars, including myself, the books date, most people dates the Gospel of Matthew around 80, 85 AD. Not 50 AD, 80, 85 AD. Okay, so this is after the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, and the Gospel is written about 10 or 15 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. So when you're reading Matthew 23 and 24 and 25, you begin to understand this guy is writing after the destruction of Jerusalem. We know that if you go to the 22nd chapter, just right before 23, because that's how numbers work, 22, 23, chapter 22 of Matthew, you go there, it's verse 7, he gives a clear indication that he knows that he's writing after the fact. He talks about the city being trampled and being burned. That's what happened in 70 AD. So he's writing with the knowledge. And the same thing with Luke. Luke's gospel does the same thing. So it's very important to understand. You're reading a gospel that's about, 50, 60, 70 years later. after the life of Jesus, which is not bad. That's good. That's good news. That's not this. Don't worry about that. That's not a problem. That's very good, actually. It's the New Testament's the best work of antiquity that we have of all writings. So if you're not going to trust the New Testament, you shouldn't trust anything else. I'll give you an example just to bring you up to date about what I mean by that. Alexander the Great. Everybody looks at Alexander the Great and says, well, we know everything there is to know about Alexander the Great because of our historical records. Well, the problem is that one of our best accounts for him was written about 450 years after his life, after Alexander the Great lived. 450 years. And the Gospels are written, 40, 50, 60 years after the life of Jesus. So, and a lot of these sources are actually based on earlier sources as well. I mean, stuff that was probably written in the 40s. We don't have those sources, but they're obviously there. So, I mean, when we're talking about the Gospels, I mean, this is highly reliable stuff, very close to the time frame. So when we say, 70, 80, 70 AD, 80 AD for the writing, don't get upset. Like, this is good news. It's good for you to understand. So Matthew's Gospel is not written by the tax collector. It's written by some guy named Matthew. We don't know who he is. First thing you need to understand. Number two, it's written probably around 80, 85 AD. The audience, this is a big thing that scholars debate massively. They debate it massively, and there's not really agreement on it. The debate is basically, is this a Jewish gospel or is it a Gentile gospel? In other words, is this written to Gentiles or is it written to Jews? I happen to think that it's written to Gentiles. The reason why I think that is because the gospel is, you see a lot of anti-Semitism in there. Basically, he's very violent toward the Jews. He doesn't like whoever wrote this gospel doesn't really like the Jews. He says very bad things about Jewish people. And so it's like, well, if a Jew wrote it and it's written to Jews, it doesn't really make sense to say such bad things. So that's why I think it's written to Jews. I think the Gospel of Matthew is a Gentile gospel written to Gentiles and for Gentiles. Pretty simple. I don't think it's Jewish at all. Scholars disagree on this matter. Some say it's Jewish. Some say it's not. You can look into that if you want. But all I'm saying is that these are the three things you need to understand. This is the lens in which we're looking at the Gospel of Matthew. And the reason why we're doing it is because we want to understand this book. We don't just want to understand a couple of passages. We don't want to understand one chapter or two chapters. We want to understand the whole book. And we really need to come into the book the right way. And the best way to do it is to go with the best information that we have. And, most scholars agree for the 80, 85 AD dating. Most scholars agree that it's not Matthew the tax collector. And most scholars probably, there's a debate on the audience, but I mean, there's a large number of scholars who definitely think it's Gentile. And so we're just going to go with that idea, primarily because when you go to church and you listen to your pastor, they're going to give you entirely different stuff. And what they're going to tell you is it's Matthew the tax collector who wrote the gospel. He is an eyewitness. They're going to tell you it was written in 50 AD, not 80, 85 AD, but 50 AD, so just 20 years after Jesus. And they're going to tell you that it's a Jewish gospel written to Jews. Well, that perspective is entirely different from what we're doing. So when you approach the gospel from your church's perspective or your pastor's perspective, you're going to get a totally different outcome. So that's why I'm not going that route, because when you go to church, you're going to get plenty of that. The rest of your life, if you're 18 years old, for example, and you just started going to church as an adult, look, if you go to church until the day you die, let's say you live to 100 years old, every pastor, no matter what church you're going to, they're all going to tell you it's Matthew the tax collector, 80, 50, and it's Jewish, written to Jews. And that's the perspective, that's the lens they're going to view the gospel from. And so this video is obviously very much different. I'm giving you something different, strictly for the purpose of learning. You don't have to agree with these three facts. You can disagree with it all you want to. It doesn't matter. But you know what? You need to learn it, because that's, knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. And, that power is only activated when you have the will to act upon it. So you need to learn. Learning stuff is very, very, very important. So the first thing that we're going to talk about in Matthew's gospel, believe it or not, are mistakes. This is another difference, another lens that we're looking at. We're going to be very critical in our reading of the text. In other words, we're actually looking for mistakes. We're looking for discrepancies. We're looking for contradictions. We're looking for problems. We're looking for poor sources. We're looking for all kinds of problems like that, mistakes, if you will, errors in the text. We're looking for them, purposely looking for them. Why are we doing this? Well, number one, because when you go to church, they're not going to do that. You listen to your pastor, they're not going to do that. And so we're not in church, and I'm not your pastor, which means I get to do that. That's what it means. The other thing is this. The reason why I want you to do this is because a lot of times when you deal with biblical information, a lot of times people just get it wrong. They just simply get the answers wrong because they don't know what they're talking about. So basically, it's unqualified people who have no idea what they're talking about, and they end up, miscategorizing people. So, for example, people who might watch this video will listen to some of the things that I have to say, or some of the facts, if you will, and they'll call me a skeptic. They'll say, "Oh, he's a skeptic. That guy's a skeptic." Oh, it's like. The problem is that you don't really know what a skeptic is, number one, and number two, you don't really know what scholars are saying, and number three, you don't really have good information about the Bible, and that's why your worldview is all messed up. So, what I'm trying to do is open you up as a Bible reader, as a churchgoer. I'm trying to open you up to so many different things. I'm trying to open your brain up to the world of biblical scholarship, and expose some of these biblical problems. Because look, at the end of the day, the Bible's not perfect. I know that's what you heard in church your whole life, but look, I'm sorry, it's just not as perfect as the church has told you. It's just not as perfect as your pastors told you. There are mistakes, there are problems, there's some discrepancies, there's some contradictions, there's some, there's some problems in here, and we should not ignore them. We should not pretend that they're not there. I think we as Christians should talk about these things. I think we should be honest about these things, and I think we should tell people, look, there are some problems, here's where the problems are, and here's how we can understand these problems. Scholars have known about these problems for centuries. They've talked about them for centuries. And there's all kinds of explanations for them. There's lots of times there's no one right explanation. Sometimes there's 5 or 10 explanations, and all of them are very good. Like we're going to see here in the genealogy of Matthew. That's the first thing we're going to talk about. And there's problems in there. Like there's problems. It's like, dude, when you're reading the gospel and the first chapter you read, there's problem after problem after problem after problem, which there are. I'll point them out to you. It sort of says, okay, well, we're in the first chapter, and if there's a problem after problem after problem after problem in the first chapter, what are we going to do about the rest of the book? If there's this many mistakes in the first chapter, what about the second chapter? What about the third chapter? What about the fourth chapter? So this is why we're being very critical in our reading. We're not being critical because we're skeptics and we want to prove the Bible wrong. Yeah, we want to be skeptical. If that's the word you want to use, I don't think skeptical is the right word. I think it's just nonsense to say skeptical. I think critical is the right word. Critical is basically the ability to critically think about the problems in there and be able to say, okay, look, you know what? There's some problems. There's some mistakes. There's some stuff that just doesn't quite add up. And it's fine. We recognize it as a problem. And the fact that we recognize it's a problem means that we have to have some type of solution. We have to have some way of explaining it. So what does this problem mean? And lots of people, they say, oh, there's a problem in the Bible, and therefore it's all hopelessly flawed. Look, that's just nonsense. To me, that's skepticism. When you use that type of logic where you say, oh, there's one problem, then the whole thing falls apart. It's all, Christianity's false. It's all fake. The Bible's false. To me, that's skepticism. I think you're a skeptic when you do stuff like that. Because you're not willing to sit down and say, okay, there's a problem. I need to understand this problem. And then I need to figure out why the problem's there. And then I need to figure out how to explain this problem and maybe possibly even solve this problem. Okay, that's what critical thinking does. That's what being a critical Bible reader does. It's the ability to identify problems and solve problems and explain problems and understand problems and tell people, look, there are problems in the Bible. And these problems are not big. Like, don't think that we're talking about all hopelessly flawed Christianity here. That's not what we're doing. We're just simply saying, look, there's some problems, and this is stuff that scholars have talked about for a long time. Scholars have known about this forever, it seems. I mean, this stuff can be traced back to even the earliest, the church fathers. They talked about some of these discrepancies or whatever. So it's nothing new. This is, any person reading the Gospels will find these mistakes. They're very glaring. It's not hard to find these problems. So there's nothing to be worried about. So understand that skepticism is pretty much the ability to not think critical. If you're one of those people who thinks, well, there's a problem, it's all hopelessly flawed, I think you're a skeptic. And I think that you should have patience. I think that you should learn more responsibility with the Bible. So, with all that, let's go and look at this. The first thing that I want to talk to you about, and before we get into that, let me just explain what you're looking at here on your screen. First of all, this is Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. So this is the entire genealogy. And I condensed it to put it on the screen so you can see it better. But basically here on the left side, we have 3 columns. This is the first part, generation 1. This is generation 2. This is generation 3. This little section down here is the last verse. It's verse 17. I'm going to read you that verse first. Here's what it says. It says, "Thus there were 14 generations in all, from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah." Okay, so 3 sets of columns here. 14 here, 14 there, and 14 here. All right, so the reason why I mention that is very simple. People read this passage and they realize 14 is a very important number because there's 14 generations, and 14 generations, right? Well, not to, get too crazy, but just to point something out really quick. There are not 14 generations here. There's not okay, so there's a problem, is what I'm trying to tell you. There's a mistake here, okay? And when you read verse 17, it says that there are 14 generations here, there are 14 generations in the second column, and there are 14 generations here. The problem is that when you count these generations, when you count the names, there's 14 here, there's 14 here, and there's only 13 in the third column. Okay? And so this has puzzled scholars for quite some time. They say, well, why is there one missing? And there's lots of different explanations, okay? I'll show you what I mean, actually. Here we are in the trusty Wikipedia, and, when in doubt, always go to Wikipedia, because everything on Wikipedia is a fact. Here's, the verse 17 I was telling you about. It basically says, look, there's 14 generations, and 13 generations instead of being 14. The problem is that verse 17 actually says that there's 14 and 14 and 14. Well, when you count the last verse, it's there. Okay, so in other words, there's a missing person. When you look here on your screen, you can clearly see what I'm talking about. Here's the first column, here's the second column, and here's the third one. Okay, and they miss Matthew. Whoever wrote Matthew missed a generation here in the last column. He just missed a person. He missed a person's name. And there have been lots of explanations as to why this name is missing, or in other words, miscounted. Why did Matthew miscount? If you don't believe me, you can open up your Bible and you can count every single one of these names. And what you'll find is that there's 14 in the first column, there's 14 in the second column, and there's only 13 in the last column. And this has puzzled scholars for a long time, and there's all kinds of explanations for it. For example, here's a website. This is Danny Zacharias is his name. And he has an article here from 2014. It says, "Understanding Matthew's genealogy and his creative counting." In other words, he has a he miscounts in verse 17. In other words, it's a mistake. It's a problem. And, this guy actually did some PhD work. It actually, believe it or not, this Danny guy does a lot of work in the Gospel of Mark. And so this is, he's an assistant professor or associate professor. Either assistant or associate, I don't remember. It's on his website somewhere. He's an assistant professor at Arcadia Divinity School in Nova Scotia. So it's a good school. Okay, this guy's not some blogger on the internet who's just making stuff up. I mean, this dude knows his stuff. And anyways, so he talks about this problem and talks about some of his PhD work and stuff like that. And anyways, he gives a handful of explanations here. These are all the explanations, or not all of them, but the majority of the explanations that scholars have given over the years. Matthew miscounted, or there was textual corruption by a scribe, or Matthew rounded up. There's all these different kinds of explanations. There's no one explanation that's correct. But the point is that scholars have realized that this is a problem. All you have to do is read the gospel yourself, count the generations, and you'll go, wow, there's a mistake. Matthew obviously miscounted in some way. He made a mistake. And so these are some of the explanations that scholars have given. There's probably a dozen here. And these are just some of them. And, it's very, this is this guy's chart, by the way. It's very hard to explain this problem. And it's sort of really along the lines of, why is the problem there? Why did Matthew miscount? Is there a reason why he did? Maybe he did. This guy here, Danny, that we're looking at, he seems to say that it was purposely done. That seems, from what I understand what he's saying, that seems to be what he's suggesting. And he could probably be onto something. I haven't looked too much into his understanding of this problem, but I would probably suspect that Matthew probably purposely did this. Because Matthew's a very interesting writer himself. He purposely makes mistakes. Now, this is just the first part of Matthew's gospel. And as I've said before, if he's making mistakes in the first part here, what about, is he making mistakes somewhere else? And the answer to that question is yes. As we continue reading on in the first chapter, we will find more mistakes like these. We will find more problems. So just here in the genealogy, when you open up the Gospel of Matthew and you start reading, the very first thing that you find is a mistake. You find a problem. It's the very first thing that you find. And this is very important to understand. Lots of people look at these genealogies and they just skip over this problem. No, this is a very, very big problem. Scholars have talked about it for a long time. And verse 17 is a very telling sign. It says there's 14 generations here, there's 14 generations here, there's 14 generations here. That's what verse 17 says. The problem is that there's not 14 generations in the third column. There's not 14, there's only 13. And so he made a mistake. Whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew made a mistake. And so when you come down here to the rest of the Gospel and you start reading, what you see is that there's more mistakes. So for example, here in verse 18, he makes a mistake. And the mistake is the terminology that he uses. So in verse 18, he says, this is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother, Mary, was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law, and yet he did not want to expose her to public disgrace. He had in mind to divorce her. So what we're seeing here, I know I'm going over this information very fast, but I'm just trying to establish very quickly that there are mistakes here. And the mistake that we're seeing here is a misterminology. So for example, he says that he's engaged to her. He's pledged to be, okay, so on one hand, he's engaged, but then we continue reading, and in the same breath, he's saying, no, he wants to divorce her. Well, how can you divorce someone that you're engaged to? The only way to divorce somebody is to be married. You have to have a marriage certificate in order to get a certificate of divorce. And so what we're really seeing is that Matthew confuses these two terms. Well, that's a little bit of a mistake, okay? And it's very similar to the mistake that we see in the genealogy. He miscounts. So not only does he can't count, but he also can't, he doesn't know what marriage is and what engagement is. He just mixes terms up. And what I'm trying to tell you about these mistakes is that these mistakes are, this is really what you need, what I'm trying to explain to you. And it's very difficult because, first of all, lots of people are very apprehensive. They don't want to call these mistakes. And I think that's just a very big problem. Because once you realize that these are mistakes, then you start to think, why are these mistakes there? Because when you really examine these mistakes, they become, you look at them as being careless, right? You say, well, wait a second, these are careless mistakes. And when you look at these careless mistakes, you say to yourself, well, we're looking at the structure here of this gospel. We're looking at the literary stuff here. We're looking at the grammar and how this author wrote this gospel, and we can see that he's intelligent. We can see that he's a good writer. And so if he's intelligent and he's a good writer, why is he making these little tiny mistakes? These are mistakes that someone of his intelligence should not be making. Okay, do you understand what I'm trying to tell you? He's making mistakes that he shouldn't make. And so the question really is, why is he making these mistakes? And it really leads you to think that Matthew is purposely making these mistakes. And I think that there's a very good case to make here that that's what Matthew's doing. Matthew's purposely miscounting stuff. He's purposely confusing terminology, saying, well, they were engaged. Well, no, they were married. He's purposely doing this because he wants to illustrate points. We also see this in I think it's the second chapter of Matthew, where he uses this illustration of Joseph having a dream and going down to Egypt and then coming back. And we see this parallel of the story of Moses. Moses goes down to Egypt to set God's people free and brings them back to the promised land. The same thing is being told about Jesus. Now, did Jesus actually go to Egypt as a little baby? Probably not. I don't think he did. I don't really think that happened. But Matthew, the question is, did Matthew think that happened? And I don't think Matthew thought that happened either. I think Matthew is reading. He's using this story as an illustration to make a point. And so Matthew is, quote unquote, making a historical mistake, if you will. Jesus didn't go, so therefore he's telling history that didn't happen, if you will. But he's consciously doing that. In other words, he's not trying to tell a different story of Jesus. He's telling an authentic story of Jesus, but he's using all these other things to explain the story of Jesus. In other words, he's illustrating the story of Jesus. He's purposely making mistakes. He's purposely leaving clues in the text, in his story. So people like me would read it, later in the future and go, wow, this guy's doing something very interesting, literarily. He's not just making stuff up. I mean, he's really doing a very fantastic job of leaving these clues in the text. And so we also see another mistake here where he quotes Isaiah chapter 7. Scholars have talked about this for a long time. He quotes Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, and he takes it out of context. All you have to do is go read Isaiah chapter 7 and look at that context, and then come here to Matthew and look at how he uses it, and you'll find out there too, and Matthew took it out of context. The question is not, did Matthew take it out of context? We already know that. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. The question is why? And I think the reason why Matthew did take this out of context is because he wanted to illustrate a point. So he appealed to authority, which is Isaiah, and by that appeal to authority, he uses it to illustrate the point. In other words, the logic is very simple. Because he said something similar, now I can say something similar. It's sort of how that logic worked. Now, we don't use that logic in our world, but back in those days, 2,000 years ago, they did use that logic. So according to his standard, it was okay to do this. Our standard says, no, it's not okay to do it. So he misquotes it. So right here in the first chapter, we see three big mistakes. We see a mistake with the genealogy. He miscounts it. We see a mistake of terminology where he doesn't know. He's not clear on being divorced or engaged or being married and engaged. And we see him misquoting the Bible. By the way, him misquoting the Bible or taking scripture out of context, this is the same stuff that Christians do today. If you've been in church long enough and you know something about hermeneutics, this is exactly how Christians interpret the Bible, very carelessly, very recklessly. They take stuff out of context, but the context that they place that new passage in is actually correct. So it's kind of weird. In other words, they're using it as an illustration, and that's exactly what Matthew is doing here. But nevertheless, there are mistakes. These are mistakes. There's no reason to think that they're not mistakes. They are mistakes, and this is the lens in which we're going to read the gospel. We're going to be very honest. We're going to be very critical, and we're going to say, hey, look, there's mistakes. I mean, it's just that simple. But why are there mistakes? And so what we've established in this video is some very important things. First of all, we've established the lens. We've shown you the lens we're going to be doing throughout this Bible study. We're going to go through the whole gospel, and we're going to look at it this way. We're going to read it this way. And we're going to try and find mistakes. We're going to try and find problems. But the way we're going to understand these problems is understanding that Matthew is not a stupid person. Matthew is not somebody who is making mistakes because he doesn't know. He's making mistakes because he does know. Okay? He knows that he's making mistakes. Look, I mean, he knows what marriage is, and he knows what engagement is. He knows that there's a difference in terms. Okay? He's not making a mistake here in terms of making a mistake. He's making a mistake purposely. He makes a mistake in the genealogy purposely. He makes a mistake by quoting Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14, purposely. And we'll see this kind of go on and on and on and on and on. Same thing with Moses. He goes down, Moses goes down to Egypt and brings the people out. Jesus goes down, he's drawing these parallels because he's trying to illustrate something. Matthew's gospel is very illustrative. That's why he has parables, and that's why he tells a lot of stories. And the text is portion size because he's illustrating the life of Jesus. He's illustrating the teachings of Jesus. He's illustrating this deity of Jesus. He's not actually telling you as if it is a fact in the way that other gospels would. He's doing it illustratively. And because he's writing with the mind of an illustrator, he's taking stuff out of context. He's making mistakes because his goal is not to tell you necessarily factual things in the way that we would understand facts. He's doing it creatively. And so he's purposely taking stuff out of context. He's purposely misusing stuff, and he's purposely changing stuff. And when you understand Matthew's gospel in this way, I'm not saying this is the only way to understand Matthew's gospel, but I'm saying in this way, the way that we're doing it, when you understand Matthew's gospel in this way, then the gospel is unlocked to you. It's you have to understand, it's like a book that's locked, and we're taking the key to unlock it, and when we put the key in, we unlock the gospel. There's a secret in the gospel of Matthew, and we're unlocking it. And the way that we're doing it is being very critical. We're looking for mistakes, we're calling them mistakes, we're understanding these mistakes, and we're saying, look, he's being an illustrator. He's illustrating stuff. So he's purposely making mistakes. And because we're saying he illustrated and he purposely made mistakes, we need to find those mistakes. So I highly encourage you to read through the Gospel of Matthew, become very familiar with it, and look for mistakes, look for problems. Look for factual mistakes. Look for stuff that doesn't make any sense. Because he puts it in there. And then ask yourself, why? Why did he put this stuff in there? It'll challenge you. It'll open up your mind, and it's a great study. It's a great way to read the gospel. There's thousands of other ways to read the gospel, and maybe one day we'll talk about all those other ways. But today, and throughout the rest of the series, because we're going to go through every single chapter in the Gospel of Matthew in this whole series. So stick around for that. Hit the subscribe button so you can subscribe to the rest of these videos, because they're going to come out every day. All right, so it's going to be awesome. The whole month of January is just going to be filled with the Gospel of Matthew every single day. It's going to be awesome. So I hope you like it. I hope you stick around, and I hope you enjoy this, and I hope it blesses you, and I hope you learn a lot about the Gospel of Matthew, and I hope you learn more about the authorship and the dating and the overall understanding of Matthew's Gospel throughout this series. And comment below. Let me know what you think. As always, I'll see you in the next video. If you like this video and want to know more, you can hit the subscribe button for more videos. If you have a question or a comment, or maybe you just like to say something or express your opinion, go ahead and comment that below. And like the video if you like the video, because liking the video is always a good thing when you like the video. My name is Adam Jordan Clark, and you can find out more about me if you like at my website, adamjordanclark.com. And as always, I will see you in the next video.